You know, this morning, listening to Kim's presentation to begin with, I was very moved because of the work that I do with Indigenous peoples in other countries. Where are you, Kim? And listening to the way in which you put that together was really beautiful. And then your introduction of Sev, and then hearing Sev lay out this incredible journey of hers and what she's been on. I thought, my God, you know, that young, and you've gone through all of that. But you know what, you come out on the other end of this and you say to yourself, after listening and watching Sev's presentation, that you must come to the conclusion that even though things are going to get rougher and tougher on water and other environmental issues, thank God we've got the young people like her in the lead, giving real leadership on these issues. And I think that's the kind of thing that we should be grateful for today. Speaking of her presentation, though, I just want to acknowledge or to bring to her attention the fact that we put out this book, Inside the Bottle, which was I think, probably the first real coverage of the bottled water industry in Canada and in North America. And I just want to say that we have a very active bottled water campaign going. And I was really pleased to hear what was said about bottled water today, but this is going to be a huge fight against the giants, against Nestle's, against Coca-Cola, against Pepsi-Cola, in particular, to some extent, Danone. These are the big four that are out there, and it's going to be a real fight. And it is a scam, as Sev said, and I think this is something that we should be aware of. And it's so good to be at a conference where bottled water is forbidden. I can't tell you the number of times I've had to walk off stages and say, I'm sorry, get those damn bottles off there, or I won't speak. And this is often the case, and this is a part of the cultural change we've got to go through, or the opposition and resistance we need to develop. It wasn't, quite frankly, until, and I have to admit this, because I'm one of these people that have not come to these issues out of an environmental perspective and orientation and upbringing and formation the way Sev spoke about this morning. I have come at things much more from a social justice and an economic justice background. That's been where my commitments have been and my struggles have been. And it wasn't until through the NAFTA fight that we began to see that there could very well be a big sell-off in terms of water, and we could find ourselves in a situation where NAFTA would allow for bulk water transfers across the border. That suddenly the issue struck home to me again, and I was sort of reminded of where I grew up and therefore the importance of water issues. It was after NAFTA, when we saw the big corporate takeovers beginning to take place, more and more of this happening. As you know, within the North American Free Trade Agreement, the actual provisions to allow corporations to move their agenda and to be able to sue governments for the violation of the rules, all of that was a part of what we call the emergence of corporate rule. And I went on from there to do a lot of work on these questions, and then eventually started to focus in on this emergence, or what has been an emergence of a global water industry, and began to give a lot of attention to that. And that work fed eventually into the writing, into portions of the Blue Gold book that Maude and I wrote. So this has been my sort of, at least a sketchy version of my kind of journey on the road in dealing with these kinds of issues. In that context, I've had the opportunity to try to come to grips with what is happening globally with water. And I think that we are definitely in an era now where the world can be carved up between water-rich and water-poor areas. And when we look at it that way, at the present time, 1/3 of the entire world population is suffering from water shortages, acute water shortages. If those trends continue, by the year 2025, 2/3 of the world's population will be experiencing water scarcity. That's how serious the trend lines are. The demand for water is doubling every 20 years, which is twice the rate of population growth on the planet. By the year 2025, the demand for water, say water scientists, the demand for water will outstrip supply by 56%. So we are heading down the path of a very serious ecological problem with regards to water itself. There are scientists that are studying the whole impact of what has happened to the water cycle or the hydrologic cycle. That cycle that Sev spoke very briefly about, where obviously rain falls, comes to the earth, goes into the ground, and then evaporates back into the atmosphere again. That really important cycle that keeps renewing water and making water a renewable, I hate to use the word resource, but you know what I mean, renewable resource on this planet. But what happens when the hydrologic cycle is damaged? And these scientists that have been working on this have been pointing out that the more we pave over the land itself, the more we expand our cities, the more we continue the process of urbanization, the more we do damage to the water cycle and the hydrologic cycle. They also point out, of course, that the more we allow industries to pollute the groundwater system, the more we contribute to the difficulty of that hydrologic cycle being able to complete its work. And then when we add to this climate change and the melting of glaciers so that the spring runoffs into the rivers do not continue, then we are adding another layer in terms of the attack on the hydrologic cycle itself. So the question in my mind these days, one of the questions has been, when are we going to come to the point of recognizing that water may not be a renewable resource, that it may be increasingly a non-renewable resource? And I think these are the issues that we need to grapple with ecologically. But there are also issues that we need to grapple with politically and economically that relate to this. And they have to do with the problem of control and the problem of ownership and the problem of power. We have seen the emergence of a global water industry which is made up of for-profit corporations, and it isn't only the big three water service corporations like Suez and Veolia and RWE Thames, or their facsimiles here in North America, United Water, U.S. Filter, and American Water. These companies are here. They are privatizing water services. But I'm saying that the industry is an awful lot bigger than that. It involves the agribusiness giants that run these huge, massive farms using mass irrigation systems, who are the biggest guzzlers of water that we have. Not the small farmers. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the big agribusiness corporations. They involve the industries now that are increasingly needing more and more water, whether it's for mining, for oil and gas, or for production of things like cars and so forth. All of this is adding to the picture. You know, it takes 450,000 liters of water to produce a car in North America today. I know it's surprising, but when you think of all the component parts and how the component parts are made and the amount of water that's used for each of them, it's a hell of a lot of water. And in the computer chip industry, which of course our society does not run without these days, a great deal of demand is put on the best and purest forms of water, 2/3 of which is destroyed and will never be used again because we do not have the technology to clean it. So I think these are all factors in the process. And when I listened to what I heard this morning in the workshops, was that people are feeling, whether or not they're saying this or not, feeling that this is our water and it's being stolen. There's a great theft going on here. And then we need to call it for what it is. But that theft isn't only the water that we have in our bioregion. Water is also important from the standpoint of who we are as human beings, because 65 to 70% of our bodies, is made up of water. You know, I always remember this when there was a privatization of water services going on in Toronto, and some hearings were being held, and a worker stood up, might have been a C.U.P.E worker, Ken. A worker stood up and he said, well, if they're going to privatize the water in the city of Toronto, they might as well privatize me as well. And there was this dead silence. Some of people smirked and laughed a little bit, and then he reminded people that we are made up of water too. Without that, without water, we would not exist. Without water, nothing on this planet can really live or exist. Neither plants nor animals, as well as human beings. So we are at the cutting edge of the future of the planet. And water is one of, if not the central issues that we have to address. Now I want to focus my presentation, because I was asked to do this, on the water movement, the water justice movement that's going on around the world. And when we talk about the water justice movement that is emerging, and I will talk about how it's emerged and things like that, I just want to say that we are talking about a phrase that's very important, and that is, we are talking about becoming water warriors. That's a phrase that came out of the Kyoto World Water Forum and the resistance and protest that people mounted and organized. People came out of that saying, we are water warriors. That's what I heard going on here today when people were talking about water in their own bioregions and protecting it and fighting for it. People were saying, we are water warriors. And so I think we need to put this into context as well. When you have the scarcity problems that I was talking about a moment ago, the division between water rich and water poor, when you have scarcity, then you have control for monetary purposes in a capitalist system. That's the way the capitalist system operates. Gain control of supply, organize the control of supply in order to be able to, and put a price on things in order to be able to control distribution according to the market. But it's also another factor involved when you go down that road, and that is that it ends up in being a part of the question of security and war and peace. And I'll come back with some examples of that a little bit later. But what I want to say right now and ask you to keep in mind is that when a vice president of the World Bank in 1999 says the wars of the 21st century will be fought over water, I think we should all think about that and recognize that that's how deep and how far this issue takes us. You're a part of something much bigger. And it's that much bigger that I want to say something about. And what I want to do, therefore, is to try to describe what is going on globally and internationally with regards to the emergence of this water justice movement that is only about 5 or 6 years old in the sense of real linking and working together internationally. And I want to do it by making references to 3 phases of that movement building. And each of those phases will be kind of marked by the World Water Forum that had taken place the beginning of that particular phase, each phase. The World Water Forum, for those that may not know or didn't attend Claudia's workshop, is really made up of the major privateers in the industry, which is the World Bank and the IMF, but principally the World Bank, the big corporations that are engaged, whether it's Suez or Veolia or some of these other companies like Coca-Cola, etc., and also made up of a number of government people that are engaged in one way or another to promote the privatization of water services. So you have a consortium of groups that are a part of something like the World Water Council and the Global Water Partnership, and together they have formed an alliance to put on these World Water Forums that occur every 3 years. The most recent one in Mexico City, prior to that Kyoto, prior to that The Hague, and then at the beginnings in Marrakesh and so forth. So this is the process that has gone on, and it has been in response to this that there has been, in part, a gathering and a getting to know each other of people around the world that are engaged in water justice struggles. So I'm going to speak about 3 phases of this water justice movement, just to give us a bit of a feel for this. The first phase is that period between 2000 and 2002. And during that, at the beginning of that phase, there was a World Water Forum that was held in The Hague in March of 2000. And at that event, there were only about 35 of us who had been engaged in water issues, that were struggling against the paradigm that was dominant at this event. This event had something like 4,000 to 5,000 people. Most of them were local government people from northern countries and increasingly also from the developing countries of the South. These people were brought there or came there, and the whole event was put on by the Global Water Partnership and the World Water Council, again made up of the major players in the global water industry. The agenda was largely designed to convince people that there were problems regarding water delivery and other kinds of water problems, including source and supply and including the kinds of issues that we've been talking about here today. But the best approach to this and the way to deal with these issues is to move down the path of privatization and corporate control. And what happened during this event in The Hague was that there were a number of people there from all over the world, as I said, but there were also a number of us, the 35 of us that had met together, gotten together from several different countries, and we were fighting against this whole process of privatization. The Public Service International was there, and with them, they had brought workers from several Latin America and Asian countries, and we were able to kind of collaborate and to start building a new awareness. Unbeknownst to us, though, at that moment, March 2000, unbeknownst to us, there was something happening halfway around the world. In a little, or not a little, but a medium-sized town in the city in Bolivia called Cochabamba. Many of you probably know the story of Cochabamba, but it is a pivotal story and a key story in this whole struggle of this movement. Cochabamba was told to privatize its water services. The World Bank had worked out a deal with the Bolivian government that in order to renew one of its major loans, it had to privatize water services. They brought in the company Bechtel, which is known for a number of other things, to privatize the water services. They set up under their subsidiary, they set up the private water company. They jacked the prices up enormously, or the water rates, pardon me, enormously. And people found themselves in a situation where 25% of their income would have to go to pay for water. Even peasants collecting water, rainwater that fell, collecting it and storing it, were being charged for doing so. This is the level of privatization that was taking place. The people rebelled. They took to the streets. First of all, around 10,000 people protested. Then it was up to 25,000. Eventually, it made it all the way to 120,000 people. 2 young people were killed as the army moved in and tried to squash the protest and resistance. There was so much protest and resistance that shopkeepers shut down their operations, and eventually there was a general strike that was created. The end result of all of this finally was that Bechtel was forced by the people in the city of Cochabamba to pack their bags and to get the hell out of the country. This was a very moving moment for those of us that were just beginning to understand what was happening in terms of the struggle for control and power over water. A few weeks later, or around that time, just a few weeks later, the World Bank meetings were being held in Washington, D.C. in April. And some of us were there as a part of the resistance. This was following the Battle of Seattle. Remember the Battle of Seattle? Yeah, 1999, December, okay. I mean, this was a great moment, eh? All before 2000, all before 9/11. Snuffed everything out. But the resistance was really building against the World Bank, and there were huge protests organized in Washington, D.C. And at that time, we were in a big church and having a big public event in the evening. And the doors at the back of the church opened around 9 o'clock in the evening, and a man came in with a hat that you saw on the screen here, or no, I guess it was in the workshop over there. And he was about 5 feet tall, and he moved up the aisle, center aisle, and came up to the podium, and they had to readjust the microphone so he could speak. And that man was Oscar Oliveira. And Oscar really was, and still is, the symbol of the Battle of Cochabamba. He was a shoemaker, and he led that campaign in the streets of Cochabamba. And to this day, as I say, he is a symbol of that struggle. The next day after that, he went and faced the president of the World Bank and told him what he was doing to his own people and his own communities by forcing the government to privatize water services. That's the kind of drama that was being played out in April of 2000 itself. Well, there were many other battles going on, as we found out afterwards. It wasn't just the Battle of Cochabamba. Similar battles were going on in Manila, in the Philippines, in Jakarta, in Indonesia, in Johannesburg, in South Africa, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, in New Delhi, in India, and in Accra, Ghana. In all of those places, there were major protests and resistance that were being organized against the same phenomenon, this privatization of water services. In July of 2001, some of these people were brought here to Vancouver. I don't know how many of you actually participated in the Water for People and Nature conference that the Council of Canadians organized in July of 2001. Can you put your hands up? Anybody here? Well, there again, things have happened that are closer to home to bring this international and global picture to what is happening here in this community. And that was an important event. So was the World Summit on Sustainable Development that was held in South Africa in September of 2002. Again, people gathered from around the world, and there were a number of major events that were organized during the World Summit on Sustainable Development focusing on water issues. And again, it became a gathering point for the work and the groups that were working on these issues. There were important reports that were developed during this period as well, reports that helped to expose what was really happening, such as the Food and Water Watch report that was focused in on Ghana and particularly on the city of Accra and the role of the World Bank. And then there were other movement-building events that were taking place during this 2-year period in the first phase. In South Africa, in Johannesburg, a movement called the Anti-Privatization Forum became a real grassroots movement, working with the townships around Johannesburg and really mobilizing and putting together a very significant resistance against the privatization of water services. A huge march took place during the WSSD, which really focused in on these issues. And then in Ghana, a national coalition in Africa, but particularly in Ghana, was organized around to fight the privatization of water services forced by the World Bank. And then on top of that, the World Social Forums in 2000, 2001, and 2002, all three of those World Social Forums began to give a lot of attention to water issues. So this was the first phase of the water justice movement, that phase between the beginning of 2000 and the end of 2002. The second phase is the period between 2003 and 2005. And here again, starting off with the World Water Forum in Kyoto that was held in March of 2003. At that time, there were, instead of having 35 people, as we had in The Hague, there were well over 100 people from civil society organizations, particularly in the Global South. I know about this fairly well because of the fact that Polaris played a key role in working with the Japanese government to get the Japanese government to pay for people or to provide resources for people to come from the Global South. And this was unique, unlike the next one in Mexico, which was not going to be possible to do it that way. There was at least some collaboration by the host government to actually engage in making that sort of thing happen. But we had around 100 people, and a little over 100 people, and we worked together in teams. And we gathered together every night, and in the morning and in the evenings, and then during the daytime, we would target certain plenary sessions in groups and go into those plenary sessions. And this was an inside strategy that was organized, and it was quite effective. And there was, as I say, more of an opportunity to do this in Kyoto than there was later in Mexico City, simply because there was an openness to that being done as far as the host government was concerned. And we ended up challenging the main priorities and orientations of 9 of the plenary sessions, 9 of the theme sessions, pardon me, and created quite a bit of a stir and a bit of a shake-up in the proceedings. And in some cases, we were able to actually turn things around. There was one session that was run by on private-public partnerships, and we were able to turn that around largely through the work that was organized through the Council of Canadians and the Blue Planet Project, but we were able to collectively to help turn that around. And then there was a big CEO forum, which they have at every one of these things, where the corporate executives are all on stage and they have a big event with several thousand people. Well, we were again able to have our people move in and challenge that. And at one point, just to give you an example of the kind of action that was taking place, one person had brought from Cancun, Mexico, water that had been taken out of the tap water system run by the Suez company, and it was filthy water, dirty water, and he brought that water with him. And he came towards the stage with all of these CEOs on stage, and they started to get a little nervous, you know. And he came up and he said, "Now I dare you to drink this water, because that's what my people have to drink every day, and it comes out of the privatized system that Suez has provided." That's the kind of energy that was present in those kinds of processes that were taking place. So there was direct challenge that was taking place in the World Water Forum. At the same time, though, the big water corporations, water service corporations, were also running into big trouble as far as the Global South was concerned. There were a string of disasters, fiascos or something, or whatever you may want to call them. For example, in Manila and in Jakarta and in Buenos Aires, those three in particular, Suez was running the water system there, and they were running into one block and one failure after another. They weren't able to do the job. They were breaking the contracts all over the place. There was resistance in the streets against their operations. And finally, Suez was saying, we're going to have to pull out of these three areas. So they were failures as far as the private sector takeover of the public water system was concerned. So this was also contributing to the atmosphere that was leading up and that was part of what was happening in Kyoto. As a result of all of this, the companies themselves actually just before Kyoto, put out a series of demands. They said, unless we have guaranteed financing for our operations in developing countries, we're not going to make new investments in these developing countries for the privatization or for the takeover of water services. At which point the World Bank immediately responded and tripled the amount of money that they were giving to water service delivery and the privatization of water services. So it gives you an idea of the kind of dynamic that was going on. At the same time, those same companies said, we're going to focus our energies and our investments more on other markets. And of course, they call everything markets now, on other markets, and particularly on North America. In North America, they said, in the United States, 85% of all the water utilities are in public hands. In Canada, it must be 99% of the water utilities are in public hands. But we want to target this market, as they called it, and within 10 years have controlled over 70% of that water service market. While I'm happy to say that 3 years later, they haven't made much of a headway, although other forms of creeping privatization that we've been hearing about here at this conference and elsewhere are taking place. But at least for us to keep in mind, they have not made that much headway in terms of their agenda thus far. We'll see. After Kyoto, there was also in the movement itself more focus in on how to deal with the United Nations, how to see if we could start getting water recognized as a human right through the United Nations process, and something called the Friends for the Right to Water was established, and a process was going on with a number of countries, I should say, on that, involving community groups and civil society groups of one kind or another. There's also been a real focus in on alternatives. In other words, just to take advantage of the failures and the fiascos that occurred, a lot of work was done around trying to build a whole new approach to what we call public-public partnerships or public-community partnerships for the rebuilding of water systems and water delivery systems. A lot of work done by groups like Corporate Europe Observatory and by the Transnational Institute have all contributed to help make this happen and to bring forward really good examples, most of whom, I might add, have come from developing countries about how to, in fact, set up real public-public partnerships and real public-community partnerships. And that's something that I think is a part of the trend, putting forward these alternative models for how to go about things. And that's been a part of this second phase. A really pivotal event that took place during this second phase, however, occurred in Uruguay. And I just want to briefly tell this story because it gives you a sense of the kind of work that people do and can do. In Uruguay, which is roughly has a small population of around 3 million people, community groups and workers alike were really concerned about two things. They were concerned about the privatization of water services that was taking place on the one hand, but even more importantly in some ways, they were concerned about the fact that they were sitting on the largest aquifer in the world, which is called the Guarani Aquifer. And so does Brazil, and so does Argentina, by the way, sit on this aquifer. But what the people of Uruguay said was that, or at least these community groups said, is that we have to stop this whole move that's going on where companies are coming in, they're mining, they're taking the water out of the aquifer. We've got to stop this. We've also got to stop the privatization of water services. And nothing short of a constitutional amendment will do that. And so they took advantage of an opportunity that they had, which was to say that if they won a plebiscite and got enough signatures and affidavits in place, they would be able to put this on the ballot, and by putting it on the ballot, they could get a vote in the general election. And so they did. They worked for 2 years to organize signatures and affidavits, I might add, not just signatures, but affidavits on every person that signed. And they compiled this and put this together. And I remember being there in 2002, 2003, in the community union halls where people were coming in, bringing their boxes of the signatures and affidavits that they had put together. And they came in one after another, and they brought them in, and then there were people taking the information and putting it in a database in a computer, but the computer was taped together with duct tape. An amazing organizing story that went on for 2 years. Well, the end result was they got this on the ballot. We found some money so that they could do some community, some real major advertising leading up to the election itself. And in the election, they were successful in winning the plebiscite by something like 67% of the people voting in favor of the constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment recognized water as a human right and as a public trust, and outlined a number of things that could not be done in terms of the private or corporate takeover of water resources and sources. This is the kind of organizing and heavy work that has gone on in those countries. Much of the work during this phase also, this phase 2, also focused in on the whole question of trade and the trade agreements, particularly around the WTO and the GATS agreement. Some of you may have known that during this period, the European Union was pushing real hard to get water services included in the GATS. But I'm happy to say that with the amount of pressure that was mounted, including secret documents that were made public and things like that, we were able to successfully stop, for the time being, the effort to get water services itself directly included in the GATS, although they still are fighting for wastewater services to be there. But anyway, just to give you an idea that has been a big part of what has been going on. There's also, during this period, some important movement building that was taking place, particularly in Latin America. By this time, many of the Latin American groups in different countries had begun to get together and form what they called Red Vita. Red Vita has become an incredible example of the Latin American water movement. I think it's something like 14 to 16 countries are involved, where civil society groups are working together, collaborating with one another, and are really building on this process. And much of this came out of the Kyoto event. When many of those people were there in Kyoto, they went back from there and they decided to organize a Latin American network that would really take this agenda on. And another important event that took place during this period was the People's World Water Forum in India, where people from, I think, 64 countries gathered together to work on, start to develop a common agenda on water rights issues and water justice issues. And once again, that People's World Water Forum that was held in New Delhi was an important pivotal event in the movement building process that has been taking place. So that's phase 2. Phase 3 brings us to the World Water Forum in Mexico City in March of 2006, and those of you that participated in Claudia's workshop will know much more than what I will say here today, but I just want to say that that was another important and pivotal event in movement building that has taken place. The coalition that had been put together that Claudia represents, COMDA, this coalition of various Mexican groups that formed to organize the alternative water forums that were to take place in response to the World Water Forum in Mexico City, was an important key event where People from a number of different countries, I think 35, 40 countries participated in this process, and maybe I'm wrong about the number on that. But again, forums that involve 450, 500 people or so. So you can see how the numbers were growing and developing in terms of the participation that took place. There were also other forums besides the actual NGO forum that took place. One particular one involved indigenous peoples, peasants, people from peasant movements, and also from urban social movements, working together for several days together prior to the NGO forum, and again working through their own understanding of what many of these issues are all about. And then there was the mass march that took place through the streets of Mexico City. 25,000, some people say as high as 40,000 were actually in that march. Anyway, it certainly was the largest march to date that we know of in terms of the water rights movement, and was an incredible event, but particularly because of the way in which the urban social movements and the people from the neighborhoods came out and participated. And much of that, as my understanding, was generated by the role that one of the newspapers played, La Jornada, of actually getting stories on water issues going throughout the entire year, so that they built up a whole new understanding in Mexico about the issues that were at stake and what was going to be happening when everybody came together for the World Water Forum itself. So there's been a whole interesting convergence of things that have been happening to help make that go on. I think during this period between 2006 and on, and what happened at the World Water Forum opens up, and particularly what happened at the Alternative Forum, opens up a number of interesting challenges that we are now wrestling with. One is the need to broaden the definition of our fights against water privatization. It isn't just the privatization of water services, as important as that is in an urban context. It's not just that. It's also a whole range of water issues that people are fighting against water contamination by mining operations and by oil and gas development, fighting against the rural water takings that are going on, where in the rural communities companies are coming in and mining water, groundwater, and taking it up wherever they can. You know, just in Mexico, just to look at Coca-Cola in the state of Chiapas, and to see just how widespread their operations are at taking water out of the most water sourced area of Mexico itself, which is the state of Chiapas, is an example of just how bad that can be. The damming of rivers that has always been a part of the water struggle that's going on, but these issues need to be brought into much more closer focus with our work. The bulk water transfers that are taking place and the linking of rivers that are going on with the damming process that goes on. And finally, the whole issue of bottled water. All of these issues and more, all of these issues are about the privatization and about the corporate takeover of water and the question of control and power and ownership. And I think we need to recognize that these are really going to be major struggles in front of us in the years to come. When we think of just the incredible industrial demands that are taking place on water today, look at the tar sands over here in Alberta. Am I pointing in the right direction? I don't know where the hell I am. But just take the tar sands, which is contributing so much to greenhouse gas emissions, right? But maybe we aren't aware of the fact that a huge amount of water is being used just to get that stuff out of the ground, just to separate the oil from the bitumen. It takes, on average, 4.5 to 7 barrels of water for every barrel of oil out of the ground that's produced, and it goes as high as 9 barrels of water for every barrel of oil. 37% of all the freshwater sources in Alberta are already committed to oil and gas production. But the Athabasca River system, which is one of the largest, river systems in Alberta, 66% of that river is allocated for the tar sands alone. Can
that water be used afterwards?
Most of it cannot. In fact, I would say almost all of it. It ends up in these mass tailing ponds, which are just, and they do not have the technology at present to cleanse and to purify or to bring that water back again as real water that can be used again. So we are really in, I think, real deep trouble on those fronts alone. And therefore, we must not only, and I think this is part of this phase 3, we must not only see water as a human right, but it has to be seen as an environmental trust as well. These two things have to go hand in hand. We can't, because you can call for water as a human right, and any industry that's involved in producing products and needs the water for it can claim that it's providing for the human water as a human right, right? We have really got to get our act clear on a lot of these things that are happening. There's an interesting story that's happening that has been going on in India around water issues, which I wanted to share with you too, and that is the story of Pachamada, which is a little village in the state of Kerala in the southern part of India. 5,000 people. But Coca-Cola put in a state-of-the-art plant there for its water and other bottling operations for its soft drinks. They ended up polluting the water system. But more importantly, they also took a heck of a lot of water away from farmers and local farmers in an area which is fairly arid. And the farmers found that they couldn't grow their crops. And so they said, what's going on here? Where's this coming from? And they finally realized the extent to which Coca-Cola was sucking up a great deal of the groundwater in the area. So they said, we got to stop this. And the women in the community said, we've got to do something about this, and they organized in the Gandhian tradition a sit-down, a civil disobedience sit-down in front of the plant. This was 4.5 years ago. You know, every day over that 4.5 years, they have continued that protest and that resistance in that village. They were successful in getting the issue brought before the local government, which is the panchayat, local panchayat. The local panchayat supported them. Coca-Cola took the issue to court in the state of Kerala to try to overthrow the local government. The state government came in and supported the local government. So Coca-Cola took the issue again to court, and eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court of India, and at this very moment we are waiting for the final decision of the Supreme Court of India. These people, for 4.5 years, have maintained that resistance. And I was there in January of 2005 at the marking of the 1,000th day of that resistance. And it was incredible. Hundreds and hundreds of people from all over were gathered for this celebration. And it was remarkable to see the strength of commitment and conviction on the faces of those women and other people in the community. And they were firm and they were tough. They had the local newspaper, and not the local newspaper, the largest newspaper in all of the state of Kerala on their side, which was a really great thing. But it was amazing just to see what they were doing. And you know, when I was there in January 2005, a week later, there were protests and resistance organized at Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola plants throughout India, something like 50 cities and towns. In one place around a Pepsi-Cola plant that I was at, 10,000 people formed a human chain around the plant. And all of this was in resistance and protest against the water takings that were going on the part of these soft drink giants. That's the kind of struggle and resistance that is taking place. And it gives, I think, all of us a little sense of what is happening. We are also seeing the incredible process going on now that because so much water is required for cities, and because cities are using up much of the water basins in their general area, that they are now having to reach into the countryside. And what's emerging is a major clash that's going to be on the horizon between city and countryside. all of which calls into question the kinds of cities and urban areas that we are developing, and the fact that we have gone past the halfway mark now in human history, where more people are living in cities at this moment than at any other time in human history. So there is now I think, going to be a major clash. Mexico City is a classic example of that. Not only are the aquifers pretty well dried up, but the water basins around the city that have been used for the water system in Mexico City have been dried up, and they're now having to pump water in from 200, 300, 400 miles out into the countryside. But where does that water reside? Where do those rivers and lakes reside and groundwater systems reside? They are indigenous peoples' lands, for the most part, or peasant lands in Mexico, either one or the other. But I saw a map, an incredible map, which showed all of the outlying areas of water outside Mexico City into the whole surrounding countryside. And all of this, most of this land, is indigenous people, or at least indigenous claimed land. So you can see that there's going to be a major clash building up on these fronts that we need to be aware of. There are new forms of organizing that are taking place, certainly in Mexico City and also increasingly in Brazil. We're seeing groups that are working with indigenous peoples and with peasant movements around water issues because they bring a different perspective to the issues. We heard Kim on this earlier today. There are different approaches on this that we can all learn from, and there's a really important process going on, I think, with indigenous peoples and dialogues. I just came from one in New Mexico where people spent 4 days, I should say, with each other talking about oil and water issues along those kind of lines. So new forms of organizing are taking place with other groups besides the ones that have been normally a part of this movement and process. And then finally, there has been also an attempt now to bring together a lot of the work that's going on, to use the month of October and designate it Blue October so that activities can take place around the world to commemorate the work that's going on water issues. And the reason that October was chosen is that it is very much in line with or at least that was the month when, I should say, the people of Uruguay won their constitutional amendment recognizing water as a human right and as a public trust. So this is, again, all part of the movement building that is taking place and unfolding in front of us today. I guess one final thing before I start to wrap up, and that is that we should also recognize that in a country like Bolivia, which elected a leader and a government, Evo Morales' government was elected by indigenous peoples and really is accountable to indigenous peoples by and large. And they have made water a top priority, and the protection of water and protection of water sources. So we're seeing internationally, even through governments, the potential to start moving in a certain direction along these kind of lines. Remains to be seen how far that goes, but it is certainly a sign of hope for the time being. Let me try then, these are the three phases that I've been trying to say, all contributing and all going on just in the last 6 years to help build an international water movement that is taking place. Nobody can say they have fully captured the essence of this movement, and this is only my interpretation. There will always be other interpretations. But I want you to get the feel that what you are doing here on the island is really, really important and really a part of a larger movement that is taking place. Something is happening in the world to wake us up to what is going on this planet, and the struggle on water is a central part of that right now. Let me conclude with a few quick remarks on a few things. This water movement really has several operating principles. And again, this is just my articulation of them. But there are 6 principles, really quick. One is the water commons, and that's the belief that water's not owned by corporations. Water's not even owned by governments. It is owned first and foremost by the people, by the plants, and by the animals themselves. It is owned, if you will, if it's owned by anybody, it is owned by the Creator. And however you interpret that, That's what we're talking about here, and the people are really, really putting an emphasis on the water commons. This should not be subjected to the marketplace. This is something that the market should keep its hands off of in terms of controlling and owning. Second principle is water equity. Again, the fact that water should not be subjected to the marketplace because the marketplace is an uneven distribution or mechanism for the distribution of things. Those that have the ability to pay get. Those that don't have the ability to pay go without. There must be a recognition that if water is a universal right, human right, then there have to be systems of distribution of water that are equitable. Thirdly, that water is the principle of water conservation. We can no longer simply rely on the fact that water is a renewable, constantly renewable resource. We have to protect it, we have to care for it, and therefore water conservation, the protection of our water sources like you're doing here on the island is absolutely crucial. Give yourselves a hand on that. Principle of water quality. Water quality. We've got to stop contaminating, poisoning, and destroying water. Hog farms, poisoning and destroying water. The processes of the tar sands and things like this, all of these things are poisoning and destroying the water itself. The more fresh water is taken out of the system because it's poisoned and contaminated, the more it contributes to the shrinking of supply and therefore the profits for those that have control over supply. We have got to stop that from happening. The process of water, the principle of water quality. And finally, the principle of water democracy. If water is so important, it should not be left to the hands of anybody else, corporations, governments, or anything else, to make decisions about it. It should be in the hands of communities. It should be in the hands of people who are people, citizens who are deeply committed to protecting their watersheds and their water service delivery systems, etc. So water democracy is a really important part of this movement. And I think through the examples I've given you, I think you've seen this water democracy very much a part of what's happening. So these are the 6 real principles that I think help to really shape and form the orientation of this movement. But underlying this is something else that's happening too, and I just want to briefly refer to it because it involves a dialogue taking place between indigenous peoples' cultures and water scientists. And this has to do with the fact that, on the one hand, water scientists are discovering something unique about the molecular character of water itself, on the one hand, which corresponds and correlates in a number of ways with the creation stories and creation myths, if you will, of indigenous peoples and cultures. Let me just give you some quick examples of this. The fact that water in trees will expand and contract in response to moon cycles is a new discovery that has been made by water scientists. But if you go back into indigenous culture and stories, you find that some indigenous peoples had already understood this and recognized this. Another example will be that water changes its crystal makeup, the crystallization of water. When you freeze water and you see the crystals in water, those crystals will change in response to different kinds of music. They will take on different formations, different crystal formations in response to different kinds of music. The fact that talking angrily at water results in a certain crystal formation versus talking gently to water results in a different crystal formation. Or the fact that the character and crystal formations will change in response to the plant life that they move through and the colors of that plant life. All of these things are new. They're not new in a sense, but they are discoveries that are being made scientifically. And what is happening is that some of these water scientists are saying, We need to be in dialogue with indigenous cultures because a lot of this was sort of foretold in the creation stories of indigenous peoples. So again, coming back to Kim's points and everything this morning, how important this is. And why it's important for the water justice movement is this, is that we need to be further reinforced with a sense of meaning and purpose as we continue to fight against the corporate takeover, the commodification, and the privatization of our water. We need to have reasons, stronger reasons for this. And these new understandings, I think, are going to contribute to that. I also want to point out the fact that as water becomes more and more important, as a very high-priced commodity, so to speak, and as water becomes more and more scarce, and the world divides itself between water-rich and water-poor areas, we're going to see the forces of geopolitics really play a big role. Some of the research that we've been doing this summer at the Polaris Institute have shown that there is a consortium of corporations, for example, that have looked ahead over the next 15 or 20 years, looking ahead at where the areas of water scarcity are in the world. These corporations, led by Lockheed Martin, the famous arms manufacturer, but includes other companies, including Coca-Cola and Procter & Gamble and other companies like that, that this consortium of companies is putting forward a series of proposals now for a change in U.S. foreign policy so that water becomes a major factor in U.S. foreign policy. And you can imagine what that would mean, especially with the Bush administration in power at this point in time. So these are things we need to look out for, be aware of, that this is on the horizon and is part of the agenda that we need to take into consideration. There is a wonderful Bolivian slogan that's come out of the struggles in Bolivia, and it's a slogan that says, "El agua es nuestra Kiahara." And roughly translated, and I'm sorry for butchering the pronunciation, but roughly translated it says, "The water is ours, damn it." That's what I've heard you people saying this morning. I hope you're still saying it. And I don't mean damn it. You make sure you put the N on the damn. But the water is ours, and we must claim control over it. We can never fully control water, and we should never fully control water. Water must flow freely. But we must keep the hands of certain people off of it, right? And so I think we need to think about ways of showing solidarity around this between the kind of work that's going on here in the island and actions and work that is going on elsewhere around the world. We've spoken briefly about Blue October, but I want to just conclude and end with telling you about something that's going to happen in India in a few weeks. November 21 to 24th in India, in 10 cities in the country, there will be major blockades against the plants of Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. The Gandhian traditions of civil disobedience will be brought into full play, and the resistance will be organized in those 10 cities. And we at the Polaris Institute are trying to inform people about this so that those people that are engaged in their own local issues and struggles may find a moment during that period of November 21st to 24th to express solidarity in the actions that are taking place. It will be very important because so far nobody knows, or very few people know, much about what is happening in India. And it's really important that we reach out and to link arms in solidarity with our sisters and brothers in India. Pardon me?
Boycott Pepsi, Cola, and Coca-Cola.
Well, that's one way of doing it, and there are other ways too, but keep those things in mind. So let me just say that this kind of solidarity action is crucial. It is crucial first and foremost because we do share a common bond and a common set of values and principles with our sisters and brothers in other parts of the world who are doing the same thing, protecting their watersheds, protecting their water sources, protecting their water service delivery systems. So let us join with them in this, and let us proclaim loud and clear, the water is ours, damn it. Thank you very much.